Hey guys, welcome back to Shooter Talk. Today we have an awesome podcast lined up for you. We actually just finished recording it, and we are going to be getting to that in just a minute. We've been looking forward to this podcast for quite a while. We've been teasing this in some of our earlier episodes, but we just finished it up. It's very awesome, so we're looking forward to that. But before we get into that, let's do a little update on what's going on in the shooting world. Jeff, what's up with you?
Well, I just got my new FX120i in the mail not that long ago. I had the old one break down. I sent you guys videos where it was just fluttering. And this is just a public service announcement. If you go online, you look for A&D, you're going to see two different websites. The one that says andstore.com is not A&D. They are data weighing systems, and not to talk badly of them, but I cannot recommend that you utilize them because they're going to charge you just to even look at the scale. And then when your scale is technically underneath warranty, they're not going to help you. I ended up talking to Adam McDonald from Auto Trickler, the shot marker, and Adam led me to talking to CE Products, specifically to a gentleman named Trevor, who was more than helpful of being like, hey, get your scale back, and send him the video what was going on. And Trevor's like, hey, dude, I'm gonna look and see what I can do. You're underneath warranty. And by the afternoon, I got a email for him saying, hey, we secured you a new scale. It's in the mail. You don't have to, doesn't cost you a thing, and do with the old scale what you will. So yeah, I'm stoked that I got really good service from Trevor at CE Products. So I can't recommend those guys enough for helping out.
Good customer service.
Good, quick, fast, and got a new scale. And I'm going to be reloading some 6.5 Creed today. And I'm going to be loading up some gas gun ammo for a match next week, and I'm going to shoot it for its very first match, and we'll see how I do with that thing. I just got to remember all the safety procedures of clicking the safety on when I'm moving, yell safe, all that. And I've already talked to one of the buddies in my squad. I said, you have full permission to ridicule me in all shapes, forms, or another during that entire match, to which he gladly agreed to do.
Is that the N135, the 223 build that you're running?
Cool. I'm going to try and get it out during the week if I can to verify data. If not, I'll do it in the morning at the match. I'll just get there early and try and verify it out to about 650, which not ideal, but I got to do what I got to do just to get some preliminary data so I can shoot the match and not make a total fool of myself.
Right on.
Blake, what's going on with you?
Oh, man. Well, through the barrels that I ordered, I got one in. That was the GT. It's been doing great. It's a 28-inch steel proof barrel, 1-7 twist, about 28 inches long, so it's a long boy. Waiting on 223 barrel. I'm kind of doing what Jeff's doing with I'm going with a 22 or 24. I can't remember. It's been forever since I ordered it. It's
24.
1-7.24. Yeah, that sounds right. It's 1-7.7 Lilo barrel. And then getting a LMT barrel back from D. Wilson MFG. It's kind of interesting. They have to put like a special sleeve on it, essentially, from the AR-10 barrel you can buy from pretty much anywhere, but the LMT's got a quick change barrel system, so they got to do something to the back of it so you can switch them in and out. So sent that off and should be getting it back within the week. But other than that, just staying busy. We got a new die concept coming in as well too. Reese, I know Mike met with them the other day, and hopefully can bring a new die to the market to help with seating force pressure. Found some pretty cool things with that. So it will be a micrometer, and will, besides the mandrel it uses and the way it's using it, it will pretty much universal besides obviously the mandrel size. But yeah, man, just staying busy. But other than that, what about you, Reese?
It's awesome. I've just got this Dillon 1050 with auto drive here behind me the other day, and so I'm starting to set that up and play with it. Just really trying to go after some automation and speed up my process here. I do got to say that tablet had never been updated, so I thought the first thing I would do would be to update the software and the firmware with it, and had a ton of problems because apparently it's an older system, and when it gets too old, the updates don't like to do very well. And I got to hand it to Mark 7, John. I don't want to butcher his last name. I can't pronounce it, but I posted to a Facebook group about Mark 7's like, hey, here's the problem I'm having, and he's from Mark 7 himself, like he's an employee there. I don't know his role, but he jumped in, helped me out. He actually went and outside of the Facebook group, went internally and found my support ticket and sent me the help I needed. It was awesome customer service. Really appreciate that. So
That's awesome. I was watching your video of you taking that thing up.
Yeah,
You're deadlifting it. It looks heavy.
It is heavy. Like, I can't believe I even was able to carry it in by myself, which maybe I need to hit the weight room a little bit.
Do you have to bolt that thing down to your table at all, or is it
no? It's got rubber feet, but it's so heavy, and it kind of like the movement is internal, so it's not gonna, unless you go crazy and it just vibrates off the table or something, it's not gonna move.
Right.
All right, so here before we get into it, let's take a word from our sponsors real quick. All right, thank you. That's been our sponsors. And let's get into our talk with Hornady.
All right, everyone, just a clarification. When you go to listen to this podcast, we did have some technical issues with Seth and Jayden cutting out, unfortunately. We've edited it to the best of our abilities, but please bear with us when we had these small little technical faux pas.
Well, hey guys, thanks for coming on. We're very excited to welcome our special guest here for today's episode, Seth and Jayden from Hornady. For those who don't know, who are you guys and what do you currently do for Hornady?
Go for it. Okay. Well, I'm Seth Swerzik, and currently I'm the communications manager for Hornady. So I kind of act as the liaison for anybody outside of our company that is mainly on the editorial side, some of the TV stuff, social media stuff, the influencers kind of thing, but just as the technical liaison between us and our products and the endemic and non-endemic media outlets. So that's what I do now. Been doing that for 2 years, and it's been pretty awesome so far.
And I'm Jayden Quinlan, senior ballistician at Hornady, part of the research and development team. So any part of new stuff, propellant, cartridge design, projectile design, kind of the whole bag, I have a pretty cool job. And Seth didn't mention it, but Seth used to work with me in the research and development field before moving over to marketing. So he's not your typical marketeer, I guess you'd say.
Well, and we do have this internal team called the Ballistics Development Group, which is kind of the assemblage of employees in the R&D field. And I guess I still go to the meetings and stuff, so it's kind of like I'm an honorary member.
Yeah.
It's awesome.
That's cool. All righty. Let's jump into it. Starting with this. With all the information you guys have been finding you guys been putting out with like your ballistic series on podcast, or Quinlan's Corner, as you call it. Sorry.
There's nothing I can do about it now.
It works. I'm sorry, but okay. Is Hornady going to publish a book with their findings in ballistics labs, similar to what Applied Ballistics has done in their series of modern advancements in long-range shooting?
I don't know. I mean, the information that we've been putting out on those is not like new discoveries or stuff that's really like new to us necessarily. The reason that it came out in the podcast, I think, is because of the nature of the format. The amount of effort it would take to put that into a book where it's explained in a way that the majority of people can take it and run with it and understand it and apply it, I think is more limited than the podcast form. Because in the podcast form, you're just talking, and you can talk about a subject from 3 or 4 different angles using different, ways to describe things. And so I think it's a more efficient way of consuming the information for a broad base of people. And the other thing is, I don't think that information should be charged for. And typically with like a book or something that you see along those lines, you have to buy it. There's definite advantages to a book. If it's on the internet, it's
hearsay.
Yeah, well, yeah, hearsay. A hard book in your hand, it's not dependent on electricity or anything like that, right? So you do have that robustness to a book. But I don't know, maybe someday it'll get added into the handbook. I don't know.
I think, like Jayden mentioned, I agree that that information, one of the things we love to do at Hornady, and what we've tried to put out as kind of an underlying tone between our Fordoff, which is the best ballistic calculator out there that's commercially available anyway, that's free of charge, and we don't want to charge for that because, I mean, we want everybody to hit what they're aiming at, and so same thing with this information. We wouldn't want necessarily to say to profit from it, largely because it's not new discoveries. It's a lot of it is just application of already known theories, and I agree with Jayden's opinion that it probably won't happen. Maybe we could get it into the reloading manual, in large scale, probably not, but put it in our first 100 pages, maybe condense it down, and then to put one more onto that. If we did do a book, that would fall on my shoulders as kind of the editorial guy. And I mean, I got strong shoulders, but my bandwidth with my already, line of job duties, I wouldn't be ready to make a book or to even assist with the book.
Yeah.
But I do think there would be value in having the information, although it's not new. It would be good to have it in one condensed location so that a user could get it and know that it was from a trusted, reliable source. I think there'd be value to have it together, but that'd be a tall order. Maybe one day when things slow down.
Yeah. Things slow down is a key one because we're not, really not in the business of selling information like you would see, with those other books. We make bullets and cases and ammo. That's how we keep the lights on here. And so our kind of view of it is, if there's information or like the Fordoff calculator, a tool that can be used to utilize those products more effectively, then you shouldn't be charged for that. That's kind of our tact.
And I love the fact you guys have that mentality, especially with Fordoff being free and the information you guys have been putting out with the podcast. We've referenced you guys on our podcast a couple of times, and then when I have new people who are trying to understand something, I'm like, if I'm not explaining it well, please go watch these episodes, and you're gonna open your mind a little bit. And that was the reason why I was asking, like you said, like, even if you put it in like the intro to your book, I think that'd be awesome, because you look at, this is not to talk down about anybody else's reloading manuals, but everyone's got a slightly different tweak on it, but they're not, I almost want to say they're not giving as much information that's, as you're saying, is known, that a lot of people know as reloaders, just because you go to a match and somebody's talking about, oh, I'm trying out a seating depth, I'm trying out something else. And it's like, well, have you like read this stuff? And they're like, no. I'm like,
Yeah.
And so we're trying to, like, more or less just try and help guys make the most consistent ammo they can, just so that they're not screwing themselves and not wasting their barrel life. So
Yeah.
All righty. So next question is, are you guys using the Doppler differently than from what Applied Ballistics is doing? AB, you can do something called their personal drag model, which I've gotten the opportunity to do. I'm not 100% sure on how they do it, but I'm curious as, do you know how similar or different you guys are using it versus theirs with your Fordoff, knowing that you guys have 437 different points of reference for yours?
Yeah, I don't know how they're doing things. I guess we could be viewed as competitors in that circuit, and so they don't go out of their way to make it known to us how they do things. I've seen reports from guys that shoot over their radar, and they get that little printed out report thing that for their personal drag model, like you mentioned. So honestly, I can't speak to it, so I'm not gonna try to guess and say something that's not correct. That would be up to them to address. But as far as the way we do radar, we've been doing radar testing since 2014, and obviously that led into the creation of the Fordoff engine and stuff like that. Yeah, to answer that specifically, it's tough to do because I don't know what they're doing. But
That's fair.
You got to know what you're doing for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of things that it's very easy to manipulate things, and it's very easy to not focus on things that will skew your data heavily. It's not just to flip the switch and go and you get good information. You really have to pay attention to what you're doing.
I think as far as the application of the data, there's a big difference there.
Oh yeah.
Obviously, they're a smart crew, so they know what they're doing. But once you have that power with the Doppler radar, how the engine uses that data could not be more different when you compare the two engines.
Yeah.
So what they do with, and verbiage is again a big part of that. When you call something a drag model, it insinuates that it's drag, and their calculator doesn't predict trajectory based on drag. It does it on BC.
Yeah, that's maybe another good point to your question that maybe you're getting to is what's the difference between how we handle the drag data and how AB handles it? Maybe would that be kind of what you were asking?
I mean, that could be it. I mean, really, it'd be obviously probably a better question if we had you guys and had Brian in the other window to find out who's doing what. But
Sure,
you guys
Yeah.
may not want to talk about what the other one's doing in front of another.
Well, to give you just a quick summary, like Seth said, of how we handle it. So what we do with the radar is when we're testing a bullet, we will test that bullet on the radar through its entire flight path. So we're shooting, a mile plus, depending on the applicability of the bullet. If it's a 5.5, say 6.5 and below, the radar is going to, let's just say 6.5. The radar is going to track that out to around a mile, plus or minus a couple hundred meters, depending on conditions. But when we do that, we're testing the bullet through its entire flight path, meaning we're not using a couple 100-yard range and we get that, window of data and then we download it and get the next window of data, essentially parsing up your mock regimes. You can run into issues when you do that. So it's the actual full flight profile of the bullet. That radar data, we attempt to get as many different barrel conditions, life of the barrel, new, mid, abused, different rifling forms, different twist rates within the application of that bullet, different muzzle devices, different propellants. We've seen that all those things can vary it. So we try to test in as broad of a sampling of those as we can, because what we put into the Ford-off engine is an average of all of that, because we don't know what you're using. Now that drag data goes through and gets combined with a software model of the bullet that then gets ran through a database to derive all of your aerodynamic moments and coefficients, which that's essentially what dictates the dynamic behavior of a bullet in flight. And so those all get combined into what you were saying earlier with those substantially more values on ours, the 437 or
yeah. So it's actually solving equations. It's solving
the equations of motion.
Yeah, the equations of motion, where a BC based calculator will calculate the trajectory based on BC. And if you give it 1, then it has 1 BC. If you give it 20, it's better than using a singular BC value, but that calculator still is using BC values, which we know can be problematic.
Okay, so that may have actually answered my next question I had for you, which was like if you compare like a G1 to a G7 drag curve, they're drastically different.
Mm-hmm.
And then looking up and reading and then having seen your guys' podcast, you guys talked about how the Doppler will track the radar, and that's completely different from the G7. So what you're saying though is that because it's doing multiple calculations throughout the flight of the bullet, that's where it's really not fair to compare like a Ford-off Doppler drag model versus a G7, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's fair to compare them in that they're both executing a trajectory solution for you, but in how they work, there's some differences there, but not really either, because when you talk about G1 or G7, you're still talking about CD versus Mach, which is the drag profile of the bullet due to its shape. So the G7 and the G1, if you're running a BC calculator, it has the CD versus Mach of that bullet in it, either the G1 or the G7. The problem comes when your bullet does not match that same drag curve. So with like Ford-off, you have the exact drag curve of your bullet in there instead of using a substitute.
Okay.
So it's fair to compare them because we're using them for the same reason, right? We're using them to calculate a trajectory to use for compensation and shooting. So being that they're providing the same tool for you, it is fair to compare them there because people are using them. However, in how they work, they don't work the same way.
Okay. I was curious about that because like you talked about if you get a PDM from AB, you get that printout, and I think like the most useful thing, like at least when you want to try and bench race and drag and brag against your buddy, was it gives you like the theoretical G7 of what your bullet is, and it's telling you, are you closer, are you the same, plus or minus of whatever the box number is. But
right.
you guys, I know with the Ford off, like I look it up on my phone. It doesn't tell me a G7, but I mean, I can go into the BC calculator and do stuff, but that's different.
Yeah.
So when you guys are talking about you're testing the bullets, like how many bullets are you guys going to test over the radar to get a profile?
As many as possible in all those different configurations to get the best average. Sometimes that's not possible. You know, like when we had competitor bullets in there, a lot of times we're going to our local sporting goods store and buying them off the shelf. Or a lot of times a customer or a guy will call us and say, hey, I love Ford off, but it doesn't have this bullet in that I'm shooting from Sierra or Berger or whoever. And he's willing to send us in some bullets, then we'll add it in. But it depends on that sample. Typically no less than 30. I mean, if it's less than 30, we can't trust the data strong enough to put it in and be a representation of the Ford off calculator.
Okay. And do you guys update the profiles over time with new lots of bullets, including your own?
We haven't yet, but we will be doing that here pretty soon because we have seen a lot of, so the Ford off came out in 2016. So, we're at 7 years now post that launch. There has been a lot of new stuff that's hit the field there in the realm of propellant availability and rifling configurations and stuff like that. So you'll start seeing some updates coming through here pretty soon.
So when you guys do that testing, or ideally, are you guys using ETVAT barrels for that for SAMI testing, or are you guys using just standard chambers when testing? I mean, anything from low data or anything with your guys' radar with Ford off?
So most of our ammunition testing is done in a SAMI conformal test barrel. So EPVAT would be a little bit different. Typically, that's like a direct read or a case mouth measurement of pressure. So yeah, we're doing conformal, meaning that the pressure measurement is taking against the case body.
Gotcha. And I know this is a big one too. You might have already talked about it, but I know a lot of people want to hear is what's your barrel break-in or cleaning methods? Because that seems to be a lot of a lot of different opinions out there on forums and social media. So
yeah, we listen to the barrel, and we typically monitor velocity. Sometimes we'll monitor velocity and drag. It depends on what it is. If it's like a pressure and velocity barrel used to test ammunition, that's all fired indoors in the lab in a fixture where we don't really do radar testing with that. But we'll monitor velocity. The guys in the lab, that's all they do is shoot ammunition through those barrels, and they're with those barrels every day, and so they have a relationship with them, I guess you could say. You know that, hey, this barrel has a tendency to get really fouled up after 50 rounds or whatever, and we start to see stuff move. So paying attention to your barrel and using instrumentation that can tell you about your barrel, like velocity and like your cleaning either practice or the solvents you're using and what they're telling you about the cleaning process, as well as bore scoping, getting a visual image of what the inside of that barrel looks like. All of those things in combination, I would say, are how we break a barrel in. Most of the barrels that we use are a single point cut, high end barrel. A lot from Proof Research and Bartlett and HS Precision, manufacturers like that have a reputation for making very high quality barrels. And with those, you see that the break in is not difficult.
Jayden was, I think, right when the screens went blank. Jayden was saying that we listen to the barrel. Obviously, we're using those single point cut rifled barrels that really don't require much break in. And then as far as factory barrels are concerned, you do see them move a little bit more. And one thing I wanted to add to what he was saying that is critical when we're talking about pressure and velocity barrel break-in and maintenance is the use of reference ammunition, because that is huge. So you can tell when the barrel's ready to go. You can tell when it's properly broken in because the reference ammunition falls right into the realm where it should. That's something that all members of SAMI have access to. There's a designated lot number of ammunition that meets certain pressure and velocity specifications. And so as you're breaking a barrel in, you put one shot, clean it, put a couple shots on it, clean it again, just kind of, smoothing it out. Then you can shoot your reference ammo at, say, 20 shots in on a clean barrel, 2 foulers, and shoot a reference sample. And if the reference sample falls within those inclusion limits, the barrel's ready to go, and you can put it in service and keep an eye on it. And again, use that reference ammo. And if it's outside of inclusion limits on pressure or velocity, you can put a few more rounds on that barrel, and you can generally put a few more rounds, give it another good cleaning, maybe another set, try the reference ammo again, and it's going to fall right in there. And so that's how we do it on the pressure and velocity side.
Quick question about that reference ammo. You mentioned that that's something you buy separately. It's not in-house, right?
We load a lot of reference ammo.
It depends on who introduced the cartridge to SAMI. Whatever company introduced it to SAMI is responsible for making the reference ammunition for it.
Yeah, whoever introduces the cartridge has the obligation to load the reference ammo, and then the different manufacturers that test in the conformal methods can buy it to make sure. That's why it's just kind of universally agreed upon.
Gotcha. So since like you guys did the SAMI spec for the 6.5 Creedmoor, for instance, and I'm working for X company, if I want to test my barrels, whatnot, I have to contact you to purchase the reference ammo?
Yep.
Okay.
So we kind of tried to organize our questions here, so it had a good flow to it. But some of this may seem like we're going back and forth a little bit. But the next question we have is kind of about what kind of testing do you do on BC variation in itself, especially with having the Doppler at your disposal?
Yeah, so we pay attention to drag variability everywhere, but where you see it as from a shooter's perspective, like have an effect on your abilities is at those half-second time of flights or beyond. But we heavily pay attention to drag variability, and you have to do it in the right way. It's easy to go looking for drag variability, and especially if you do it across different days. Your wind conditions during testing are vital when doing drag measurements and looking at drag variability. So meaning if there's any head or tailwind variability while you're doing drag testing, that's going to show it if it's unaccounted for. Meaning I tell, I put in that the tailwind is 5 miles an hour, but in reality it's 10. And there's variation in what I'm accounting for and what's occurring. There's variation in that shows up as drag variation, because the only thing the radar is measuring is velocity and time, and those head or tailwind components will have a contribution to the projectile's velocity. And if you don't account for those, the only thing to associate it to is drag. And so it's something to pay attention to, but you have to know what you're doing while you're measuring it.
Do you kind of have like a standard for what your acceptance level is for that variation?
Yeah, it really depends on kind of the application class of the projectile. Most of your just general purpose or hunting bullets are going to have let's say a 20 to 30 shot drag standard deviation of 1.5 to 3%, somewhere in there. When you get into long range style match bullets, you would prefer those to be 1.5 or below. But there's a lot of things that play into it, so it just depends.
Okay. Have you noticed a difference in tipped versus non-tipped bullets in that variation itself? Especially with you guys having A tips.
Yeah, especially from lot to lot.
Yeah, what you see a lot of times is with the bowtail hollow point bullets, as the jacket material is drawn up into the final swage where the ogive is formed, that material flows differently, and there's variations in the bullet because of that, and those variations can correlate to drag variability.
Yeah, sure. I just remember we got some competitor product in, bowtail hollow point style bullet, and within the lot number of the bullets we were testing, the drag variability was pretty remarkable, very, very low. However, the next lot, which was also good, was significantly different in drag than the original lot that we tested. So with those, like he's talked about, the hollow point formation and the ogive formation, that material, as it pushes up into the nose, can cause some trouble from lot to lot.
That's why you see us use the tips on the ELD match line and obviously the A tip line, is because when we manufacture that tip independent of the bullet, it's the exact same every single time. So we get rid of that variation that's common in a bowtail hollow point.
So when those are formed, you form it almost as if you would a bowtail hollow point, and then do you trim it back and add the tip? Is that kind of how that is able to get that consistency?
Yes.
Okay. All righty.
So I guess with we might have missed this one here. With talking about barrels, especially now going into chamber designs a little bit, do you see anything different as far as like freebore diameters, especially with newer modern cartridge designs opposed to old samey designs, really make a huge difference in precision or just any? I mean, what's kind of the design there? Why do they do that?
Yeah, you want this one?
Well, I mean, yeah, that's another thing that, when you look at new cartridge design is kind of frustrating at some level, is that there are a lot of cartridges that get introduced that have somewhat sloppy free bore diameters. And it's not a secret that if you tighten that free bore diameter up, generally you're going to have better accuracy on the average, and that's something that we take very seriously when we design a cartridge, is the diameter of that free bore, helping to align that bullet through the center axis of the bore more consistently every time, every shot. And it's not just from this gun or from this particular lot number of ammo. When you're trying to load millions of rounds of factory loaded ammunition, and you want gun companies to produce tens of thousands of rifles chambered in that cartridge, and you want that factory ammo and that factory rifle to shoot really well, that's one of those critical dimensions that you have to control.
Yeah.
Okay. So what steps do you guys go through when you're designing a brand new cartridge?
Well, we generally start with the job or the application of that cartridge. What are we wanting to do? What role are we trying to fill with it? That will generally figure out the answer to that question will tell you what bullets you need to be able to do that job, and the distance and terminally and all that type of stuff that you're looking for. That narrows you down into a classification of bullets. From there, you can figure out what muzzle velocities you're going to need to produce to be able to do that job with those bullets. Then from that, you can start to determine, okay, well, with these muzzle velocities, I'm going to need to be using probably this classification of propellant. Charge rates are probably going to be in this range. And so then you can take the cartridge case and you can wrap it around that whole package, and everything is designed in a way where it supports the job that was defined originally. So there's not the inadvertent use of something easy because it's pre-existing that goes against one of your design criteria. We see this a lot in the wildcat world, where a guy will take a pre-existing cartridge because he doesn't have a brass manufacturing plant, and so he's going to use that already exists.
Understandably.
Yeah, and he's going to modify. And sometimes this works fine and there's no trade-offs, but sometimes there is trade-offs. And he takes that and he modifies it to do what he wants, but it just so happens that it would be better if it was modified even more so than he's capable of modifying it, but he's stuck with living with that compromise because he doesn't have that at his disposal. So we kind of design it in like a backwards approach.
Okay. I mean, it's a logical one. So how do you guys go about doing a load development with a cartridge that you're familiar with?
Oh yeah,
Go for it.
Yeah, well, I think our answers are probably very similar. I know we outlined them on the podcast, but I'll talk about a match rifle. You can how you do your hunting rifles, but for me and my match rifles, I have the cartridge, I have the gun. I identify what bullet I'm going to shoot. I'll take my most accurate match rifle, which is a 6 Creedmoor HS precision barrel, and I want to shoot the 110 A-tip, and I want it to be going 2850 out of a 26-inch barrel, which is pretty modest for a 6 Creedmoor. And I know that I can get that velocity at a moderate, 58,000 pounds of pressure using somewhere between 34.5 and 36.5 grains of Varget. And I'll shoot one at maybe every half grain to identify kind of where do I hit that velocity number I'm looking for. And in this case, in that particular rifle, it's 36 grains even of Varget. I loaded 20, seated that bullet to 2.8 inches even, and shot 20 and it shot 1.3 inches at 200 yards, and that done. Moving on with my life. And average velocity was 28.56, I think, on that particular gun. And
How
it's
many
that easy.
How many rounds did you say you put down?
20.
20.
Right on.
Yep. Yeah. 20 shot group, 1.3 inches. It's going to get a little bit worse than that if I shot another, 10 or 20 into it. But the Ayler system that we use in our accuracy tunnel will hold a 20 shot sample. So it's easy for me to be able to just shoot 20 look at the results, versus if I wanted to shoot more than that, I'd have to dump the XY coordinates of where those bullets impacted into an Excel sheet. So it's just an extra step. But like I said, at 1.3 inches at 20 yards, it's the best shooting rifle I have. The best, probably the best 20 shot group I've ever shot from the shoulder ever. And it was literally that simple. And I do that exact same thing for every time I do low development.
It must be so nice to be able to do low development in a tunnel.
It's not so bad, but so that was a very specific analogy or example, but more generality. I pick the bullet I want. I seed it to magazine length. Our ogive profiles, at least in our testing, have showed to be very insensitive to jump depth. So I seed it to magazine length. I identify a propellant that I know is accurate and temperature stable. So usually it's a single based extruded propellant. And then I shoot one shot at each half grain or so until I find the velocity area that I'm okay with running. And then I load 20 of them up at that length and shoot them. If they shoot good, I'm moving on.
So with that, with the velocity, you're not doing that part of the test until you've broken the barrel in a bit, though, just because of the barrel's potential.
On a new barrel, I usually take 20 shots because I can get a box of 20, and I'll play around, maybe shoot a 3-shot group, clean it, a couple 3-shot groups, clean it, maybe a 5 here and there for 20 shots. And then I'll generally try to put another 4 boxes of ammo through it, getting the scope zeroed, kind of running it out to range. I'll just take it to the range with me with other rifles and kind of throw it in the mix. And then I start doing that type of development, if you can call it that, because it's not real labor intensive, at 100 rounds usually.
Okay. So now what about when you have how do you do the load development when you have a brand new cartridge that you're designing, or if it's like a Wildcat?
Well, because we work here, we get to introduce a pressure and velocity vessel to measure that stuff, so you're not just out there playing around. But if it's an established cartridge, I do the same thing. On a new cartridge, like Jayden mentioned, we kind of isolate what we think the propellant charge will be of a certain burn rate of powder, and then we can pressure test it to make sure we're where we want to be.
Yeah. And even in that, we have to pick a powder to start with. Even though we have a pressure test barrel that's going to give us measurements, we still have to go through a similar process to what, somebody that doesn't have that, all they have is a rifle, would have to do. And that is, what powder am I going to start with and what charge weight am I going to start with? An easy thing that you can do there is look for similar cartridges. Try to keep with the same caliber, so the same bore diameter, and try to find a cartridge that is similar in case capacity. And you're probably not going to find it exactly, otherwise it would already exist. Why would you be wildcatting what you're wildcatting? But try to find something similar. So generally you can find something that's, a little bit less capacity, a little bit more capacity, and go look for established load data with that. Is there a common denominator of propellants that's used in both of them? And then you can kind of, interpolate your way between those two knowns to figure out, well, I'm probably going to be in this range of charge weights with that powder, and then, drop yourself down a bit for a safety margin to start. That's the same thing we're going to do when we wildcat something, is we'll go look at other established data that we have and say, yeah, it's probably going to sit right around here. And then we'll go, once you start shooting it, then you know more and more the more you shoot.
Okay, that's fair. Like I have a Wildcat of a 7 Sherman short mag, and its parent case is like the 7 SOM. Mm-hmm. So I never did that. I went off of the guy who wildcatted, he had a bunch of data for it. So I may go back and look at that just to see how that correlates. Okay, so now let's get into a bullet design. How do you design a new bullet that's supposed to work with existing cartridges that are out there? Example, like you have your 108, 109 ELD, and even like the 110 A-tip. But how do you make sure something like that will work in something like a 6BR, which you guys didn't semi-spec, versus like your 6 Creed, which you did?
Yeah, most of the bullets are designed to work within the standardized configurations out there first. If they work in some of these odd wildcat things, cool, but we generally don't design a bullet just to work in a wildcat option. But most of those, by nature, a wildcat comes from something that was pre-existing a standard anyway. So generally you don't run into issues there. But we start out with dimensions first. It has to be able to fit within the chamber. It has to be able to sit within the cartridge case and fit within the chamber. And then we do quite a bit of modeling on the aerodynamics of the bullet and its stability, gyroscopically and dynamically to make sure that we're not going to have any weird stuff going on with the twist rates that it's kind of intended for. And then a lot of times we will verify those numbers by shooting at very, very low gyroscopic stabilities and see at which point what you'll see as a bullet gets more and more gyroscopically unstable is the dispersion. The group sizes will be pretty static, and as you approach the limit, you'll start to see your group sizes open up, and then once you go past the limit, now you have bullets that are unstable and your group sizes go quite wild. So that would be an easy rundown of what we do there.
Yeah.
As far as your guys' secant line of projectiles, I don't know if we mentioned this at all, but I noticed you guys were talking about redesigning possibly, or at some point you did with your ELDM design with the secant projectiles, the ogive slope. Is that because it doesn't tip in bore as easy, and is that necessarily why that projectile is not quote unquote sensitive to seating depth?
Yeah, it's dependent on so many different things. I have seen certain barrels that can be quite jump sensitive, chamber designs, stuff like that, and some that aren't. So is the projectile shape, and specifically the ogive shape, secant or tangent, playing into that? Most certainly. But is it the sole driving factor? Probably not. So you'll probably see trends with it, and we've seen the same thing that you just said there, that they seem to be very insensitive to jump. Where we see bullets become more jump sensitive is when you get to the really, really aggressive designs, where the ogive is extremely long, the bow tail is extremely long, and the bearing surface gets really short. That's kind of your wheelbase that helps you keep the bullet straight. And the shorter that gets and the more aggressive the two ends get, generally the more jump sensitive I would think that bullet would be.
And we've seen that in production, that longer bearing surface bullets generally shoot better groups on the average than a similar bullet with a shorter bearing surface.
Mm-hmm.
And likewise, like everything Jayden just said, I would speculate that the free bore diameter also is going to play heavily into that as well of the cartridge you're shooting.
All right. So we got a series of questions here kind of related to dispersion, because that seemed to be really popular on your guys' podcast to the point you had to do multiple episodes about it. So,
right.
So the first question here is kind of a lead into some of the rest of it, and piggybacking on our bullet discussion. Should we be sorting bullets, for helping this dispersion out? And if we should, would that be better to go by the ogive or the overall length?
Should you be sorting bullets? It depends on what your time is worth to you. The question there would be, is making things more consistent better? Yeah, probably, right? But there's a cost to that, and that's your time and effort. So is taking the time to measure bullets, whatever method you want, based on the ogive or overall bullet length, is that going to give you a performance benefit that justifies the time and effort you put into it? Don't know. That's dependent on the unique circumstance of your situation. What's a better way to sort bullets? I mean, you could take it either way, really. Sorting bullets off the ogive, you're kind of trying to gain consistency in the amount of jump to the rifling that the bullet is going to have, because that's typically the point that you're measuring at, right? Is about the bore diameter of the bullet. You can, a lot of guys sort by weight too. We've done all this, like we kind of said in that podcast, and we've seen it doesn't matter when your sample sizes get large enough. It all kind of normalizes out. Now, if you're using very low quality bullets, yeah, there's probably some value in that. If you're buying like some blemished 55 grain FMJs from overseas somewhere, you might benefit from doing those measurements. If you're buying an American made match bullet, probably not, because the measurement instrumentation that we have here when we manufacture a bullet, in most cases is probably more effective than what a reloader or a hand loader is going to use. I mean, we're going to spend more money on that, right, to ensure the quality of our product versus what you're going to do to try to sort. So it's likely not as effective as you think it might be. Don't know though. It's totally dependent on your circumstance. And the other part of that is the mental side of it. If you believe, if you're the type of guy that wants to make everything like as perfect as possible so that your headspace is right when you go to use it, there's no rocks unturned or questions unanswered, then definitely do it. Because we've seen that a lot of times. You know, a guy that we've seen guys that have two systems that are they have the exact same capabilities, but the guy that believes in his and the guy that doesn't believe in his, there'll be a performance difference, even if their skill sets are identical. You know, do it within yourself. I've had that happen to me, where I go to a match with a rifle and I'm questioning what's going on. I don't perform as well than when I do when I think, yeah, I got this stuff nailed. And there may be absolutely no difference between them on a statistically valid sampling. So that kind of skirts around your question of probably, you know, wanting to know like, oh yeah, you do this and it makes things better. But the honest answer is it kind of depends. I can't guarantee you that it will.
Yeah, no, and I think that kind of goes back to what you've said time and time again. You know, at what point are we going to define that it actually makes a difference, and is it worth it? So.
And test it. You should test it yourself. I mean, don't look to us for an end all be all answer, because you simply can't give one for the amount of variation that exists out there in people's systems. It's way more encompassing than a single, you know, 1 point answer. So test it yourself and see, you know, and then you know for sure if it's worth your time or not to do it.
We're kind of in the process right now of we're trying to form either like a website, blog, something where we want to do a test, whatever the test is, and we want other people's input for it. So we're going to put out like a set of like, this is what we're going to test. This is how you test it. So everyone kind of stays the most consistent. And that way people can send in their data so that we can get a broader set of data points, so that it's not just like, oh, it worked in mine, but it didn't work in Blake, so something's wrong with his. It's like, no, what were the differences? What's going on?
That would be cool.
That would be awesome.
So when measuring dispersion, you kind of alluded to mean radius a little bit. It didn't seem like it got into too much depth on it, but I mean, the classic way of measuring it is the extreme spread or your group size. So do you think mean radius is kind of a more encompassing, like a better thing for us to gravitate towards for actually talking about group sizes?
If you want to know more about your group, yes. I mean, they're both valid in their own ways. They just tell you different stories. So the old traditional group size or extreme spread tells you how bad was it. There's some value in that. You know, you can take that. And I mean, for a very long time now, we've all talked in that language only. You know, what group size is this thing? Shoot. The thing that group size lacks is that it only accounts for 2 data points, regardless of how many you fired. So it's a very, very coarse measurement. Mean radius is the radius from, you know, the distance from the mean point of impact to each shot, that linear distance. You take all of those and average them, and that becomes the mean radius, or another way we like to talk about it is the average miss distance. Because if you didn't hit your target because the bullet was a ½ inch to the right, then you missed by a ½ inch. So that mean radius is your average miss distance. That gives you a much better tool to understand what you're capable of than a group size standpoint, because now you're starting to add some probability into it beyond just possibility. You know, like group size is more of like a possibility type metric. Yeah. So if your group size was 1 inch and you're shooting a 2 inch target, you can be pretty confident that your probability of hitting that target is really good. But if your target is let's say 3/4 inch, your probability question is still kind of up in the air when all you're dealing with is group size. What mean radius does is kind of bridges you from that world of just, is it possible or not, into how probable is it? And I would say it's a much better metric there, because it considers every data point. And so the higher your sample size becomes, now you get into like statistical, stability of your data. You know, the mean rate, a 2-shot mean radius doesn't tell me anything more than group size does, because it only does 2 shots. So now we're getting into, yes, you have mean radius is more valuable because it takes into account more shots. So feed it more shots so that your data is better. It's more stable. Tells you a better story.
So, so when you guys were talking about your shooting more and more shots in a single group, that decreased your percentage of standard deviation relative to what you saw in that group size. Now, what shots become reasonable on mean radius compared to just looking at the extreme spread?
it's still subject to the same sample size. You can't really shortcut sample size by the metric you're looking at. You can, I mean, in consideration that mean radius takes into account every single shot where group size is only 2. Yeah, mean radius might tell you more at 10 shots than group size does at 20, maybe. You know, you could think of it that way. But I would say there's no shortcut to sample size. And getting to that 20 or 30 is where we have seen things become stable. You can do less than that, and we've talked about that too. You know, like if you have a really good shooting gun, if at 5 shots it's one ragged hole, and at 10 shots it's still one ragged hole, probably likely that as you continue, it's still going to be pretty one ragged hole-esque, right? It might open up a little bit, but that's probably a pretty good system if it's made it that far and it's that good. But where those wheels kind of fall off is in that middle 80%. That would be like the 10% use case, right? Like the 10% best use case. But you still have that middle 80% that is that uncertainty. It's not that obvious that it's that good. We're trying to distinguish between two things that are kind of similar, and we're trying to figure out which one is better or not. That's where you have to up your sample size for it to tell you the story. Would you agree with that?
100%. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, because I've done some comparison on things and trying to use like a t-test to differentiate some of the results with smaller sample sizes, and it's able to run the test, but it doesn't necessarily mean that your variation is small enough to actually distinguish the difference in those results.
Right. Yeah, when it comes to statistical stuff like that, and I know we've talked about it in regard to standard deviation because that's a common metric that's used, your sample size has to get high enough to start to populate that distribution profile. Say it's a standard bell curve, the Gaussian bell curve, or a T distribution, or all these different distributions that exist out there. Your sample size has to get high enough that thing is populated in the distribution profile for that number to be of any value to you. So if you try to shortchange the sample size game by using these different statistical tools, say like a t-test or so many others that are out there, you're at the mercy of did the sampling I take, is it a good representation of the distribution profile that exists? And in our experience, it's not. There's no way to shortchange it.
As I say, this doesn't say that it didn't make a difference. We just failed to prove anything with the set of data that we have.
Yeah. And generally, if it did show a difference, it would be obvious to you without running the t-test, right? Let's say you did a sample of 10 and a sample of 10. And one of them was 1/2 inch and the other one was 2 inches. If you run the t-test on those two, you're going to see a difference, but you also saw a difference before you ever ran the t-test. So the ones that are plainly, obviously different without running any sort of statistical analysis on them, the statistical analysis is going to tell you what you saw in plain difference. But when you're trying to sort between two things that are very, very similar, you can't shortchange the sample size. You have to get that correct to be able to tell the difference.
So when you guys are doing your dispersion testing, does it all happen at the same distance, like 100 yards?
No, we do it all over. It just depends on what we're looking for.
Okay.
I'd say the majority of it, at the facility is done at 100 because we have established ranges there, right? Our indoor test facilities.
200.
Yeah. We have a 200-yard accuracy range. Then we have a 100-yard indoor tunnel for like our pressure and velocity barrel stuff. And then, outdoor stuff, we do dispersion anywhere from 5 to 2,500. It just depends on what we're looking for. We do pistol dispersion at 5 yards and at 50. It
25,
just totally depends.
So those results that you have, say, indoors at 100 yards, is that the same dispersion still match up then when you go out to those further distances?
Yes, considering velocity and considering drag variation. Yes.
Okay.
So another way to look at that would be, let's say I shoot a group at 100 and shot number 7 is like down at 6 o'clock. It's the lowest round in the group. That round will continue to be the lowest round in the group as we work out and the group starts to get bigger and bigger as a function of range or of time. That one will always be the lowest. unless it had a higher velocity than the rest, or the drag was lower than the rest. Then it'll start to work its way up into the middle or possibly up to the top of the group. It depends on the time that's available for it to do that.
Okay, I'm glad you said that in that way, because where my line of question was going is wanted to. You said that you didn't notice increases in dispersion unless you had like larger than 0.3, like of grains of powder difference. Like if you had a grain of powder difference, you could see a difference in dispersion. But I didn't know. All right, well, that doesn't take into account necessarily velocity at long distance. Is that right? So considering velocity were the same, that 0.3 might actually show up at distance, even though it didn't show up at 100.
It could, yes.
Okay.
But that would likely be from the source of velocity, not from dispersion. The angular outward nature that you see in a group.
Okay. So with those, when you were looking at lower charge weights and you saw better dispersion, do you think, I guess this might just be more of an opinion, that was caused by the reduced dynamic instability from running a slower bullet?
You wouldn't necessarily reduce dynamic instability. Dynamic instability velocity is a part of that, but there's a whole bunch of other things that are a part of dynamic stability too. So I certainly wouldn't say that. That's kind of a different animal.
Okay.
I would. There seems to be something there where when you reduce the charge weight and things shoot better, that might be tied to the fact that you're not pushing everything to the limit. So I think we've talked about before, easy way to look at it would be, let's say that the error is static and it's a linear, like a fixed percentage. So if let's say it's 10%, if I'm running a higher charge weight and my pressures are up at 60,000 pounds and I have 10% variation, that means I have 6,000 pounds of variation. If I drop that down to 50,000 pounds and that variation is the same, it's still 10%, I now have 5,000 pounds of variation. So it could be something along those lines, and not just using pressure as the driver, but that principle could be applied through all the different dynamics that are occurring on the internal ballistic cycle. Maybe that's it. I don't know. I wish I could sit inside the barrel and tell you, but
so
haven't figured that one out yet.
I mean, no, that's a good point, that the magnitude of that difference changes, even though the relative difference is the same.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
So to follow up on that question too, is there any manufacturing process that you guys can talk about that helps ensure dynamic stability of the projectile specifically to help eliminate dispersion, or hopefully that makes sense there?
Yeah, I mean, it's mainly driven by the projectile shape and the mass layout within the projectile. And yes, we certainly take those two things into consideration for the bullet's dynamic stability downrange. Generally, you see, I mean, dynamic stability kind of gets a inflated reputation within the community. So dynamic instability would be what you hear about, like, oh, transonic instability, that you'll hear a lot of guys talk about, like, oh, don't shoot your bullet into trans or things are going to go crazy and stuff like that. The times that you can observe that on the Doppler radar when that occurs, and the times that I've observed that are in the single digit percentage, on probably nearing somewhere between 50 and 100,000 shots on radar. So the reason that you see that thrown about so much comes from the ballistic calculator questions that Jeff had originally with like G1 and G7 and stuff like that. Generally, what you see is the time of flights where trajectory predictions begin to fall apart and have problems with BC-based calculators correlate to, oh, that transonic region of bullet flight. It's not the transonic region of bullet flight that's causing it. It's the fact that you're using a drag curve shape that doesn't match yours, and that by the time you get to transonic bullet flight, enough time has elapsed that you're seeing an error in your trajectory prediction, and you associate that as, there's not a problem in my trajectory prediction, it must be a problem in the bullet's dynamic stability. But the times that we've actually seen that is actually very, very low. So a great example of that would be, have you ever taken a 308 and fired it past 1,000? A lot of your listeners have. Well, that bullet's well into transonic. Have you ever taken, take your pick, a 5.56 and fired it out to 600 or 800 or 1,000?
Mm-hmm.
The bullet kind of hits fairly predictably. It doesn't just wildly zing off in these directions. That's well into transonic. So there's plenty of examples out there that kind of counter that, but I would say that is why it's held as a thing to go point at that's wrong, within the community.
I love correlation versus causation examples. That's great. So with the lower charge weights that you were seeing, the better dispersion, did you reach a point where that lower charge rate actually increased the standard deviations in your velocity?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, when you start to get to low case fill levels, you're gonna start to see increased pressure and velocity variation just from the positioning of the propellant within the case relative to the primer.
So how, in what you've observed, how much of SD in your velocity are you going to need before you actually notice dispersion differences?
Depends on the time of flight, and it depends on your target size.
Let's stick to like PRS style shooting then. So you're 1 to 1.5 MOA.
So inside of a half second time of flight, you're probably not going to observe any level of standard, within reason, right? So let's say a standard deviation of 10, and these are statistically valid standard deviations based on at least 20, 30 or more shots. Standard deviation of 10 versus a standard deviation of 20, let's say. Out to about a half second time of flight, you're probably not going to notice the difference of the two. Let's say from half to 3/4 of a second, you're going to start to notice it, and it's going to start to wreak havoc on you. And then let's say beyond 3/4 of a second time of flight, it's like noticeably a problem that you're having to deal with. Like things are just high and low, and they're all over the place. But it totally depends, because that 10 and 20 standard deviation are not equal. With a 300 PRC with a 250 A-tip, that's a totally different story than with a 308 with a
168.
Yeah, a pumpkin chunker, right? So the drag the drag plays into it as well. But so that's a tough one to answer with just a universal rule.
Yeah, I think I was talking to Miles, so I'm gonna make this secondhand information, and so if I get it wrong, we can correct it later. But I believe his kind of line in the sand was 12 to 13 on his SD. Anything better than that was a bonus.
Oh yeah.
But anything worse than that, you could get it better. It can be better than that. So his line in the sand was 12 or 13.
Yeah. So we're leaving to a PRS match after this, and I think I had 35 shots of this ammo that I'm going to be shooting. So I did it over different days and stuff like that, but a total accumulation of 35 shots. My standard deviation on those 35 shots was like 15.6. I took that and ran it through a calculator that we have that gives me hit probabilities based on feeding it known information. And on a, let's say, minute quarter target, which is probably pretty average for a PRS match. And this match, the longest targets are out to about 1,000. So I ran it for inside of that. My hit probabilities out to 600 are north of 85%. And then from 600 to 1,000, I think it drops down to around somewhere in the 60 to 70 range at 1,000. So, and that's with a standard deviation that most people would scoff at. Again, it was based on multiple days of testing, different temperatures. I didn't account for the temperature because this is going to happen to me at the match. We're going to be from 30 to 80 degrees during this match. And so that kind of gives you an idea, even with a standard deviation of 15, which most people wouldn't want to touch. They want that single digit stuff. On a sample size of 35, you're going to get that.
Excellent. What are the top 3 to 5 things any reloader should really focus on to get the biggest improvements on a dispersion basis?
You want to take that one?
Yeah, we can. My top 3 would be pick a good bullet and a bullet that is known for accuracy, and run that bullet. So it's got to start with a good bullet. Obviously, the barrel plays into it, but a good bullet. But in regard to reloading, pick a good bullet. put an inside chamfer on your case mouse, and basically choose like I mentioned earlier, a really good single-based extruded propellant that gives you really good load density. That would be, in my opinion, kind of the three of the more important things.
And if that doesn't work for you, change the powder.
Yeah.
A couple times. And if that doesn't work for you, change the bullet and then change the powder some more. And then if that doesn't work, then get a new barrel.
Yeah.
So Blake, I was chasing my tail with 308. I was just problem after problem. I couldn't get the results I really wanted. And Blake kept saying like, no, you should look at a different powder. Try changing the powder. I'm like, no, I'm using Varget. Like Varget's like the powder. And finally I changed the powder and boom, problem gone.
Yeah, we see that as the most dramatic change. It's a powder and barrel combo is the big one. So we've seen where this powder bullet combination shoots really good out of this barrel and shoots like crap out of this barrel. And this barrel that it shot like crap out of, it shoots the same bullet with a different powder, shoots just as good as this barrel did with the other powder. So it's just a mix and match.
They have attitude.
Yeah,
it's changed. But yeah, as far as knobs to turn, you can turn that one knob and see dramatic change in your dispersion.
Yeah.
There's not very many other things that you can do that give you that much gross adjustment.
Yeah.
It's excellent. So our last three questions here, they're kind of oddball. They don't really fit in kind of with a lot of the rest of what we talked about. First one here, have you guys tested anything with primer seating depth?
Yeah, so your primer seating depth sensitivity will definitely play into, or your primer seating depth plays into the primer sensitivity, which is the primer going to go off when your firing pin or your striker hits it. So that's kind of a go no go category. Once you're good enough there, you're good enough. Beyond that, we haven't really seen that it affects a whole lot. I mean, even switching primers, we haven't seen that it affects a whole lot. If you're using one of those modern chamber designs with a good bullet and good propellant, I can swap primers around. Where you see primers really start to make a difference. Now, I can swap primers around with quality primers, right? If I buy some no-name thing out of an old Eastern Bloc country that's for sale on the cheap at the gun store or gun show or something.
That's what I'm shooting right now.
might have some issues.
Bang, man.
Yeah. So let's say good quality American-made primers. Don't see huge differences between them, but it's cartridge dependent as well. So if you go from a standard primer to a Magnum primer, you're going to see differences. You can see issues more so related with the primer when it comes to environmental temperatures or the temperature that your ammunition is at when you shoot it. And there for a while, the craze was 6.5 Creedmoor small pocket cases because you could juice the pressures up more and not see it as easily because there's more brass in the case head. And there was maybe some data out there that said it would lower your SDs. In the testing we've done, didn't make any difference at all. But what can happen when you're using a small rifle primer, which is designed to light off propellants and charge weights up to the mid 30 grain range, maybe. Once you go beyond that, you should be using a large rifle primer, which a 6.5 Creedmoor is taking mid 40 grain charge weights of a mid burn rate speed of powder. You can certainly see problems and even get into hang fires at cold temperatures when you use a small rifle primer there. So it just kind of depends.
So the other oddball question we had here, because I keep on hearing it, you guys might have heard it as well too. It's in like a common, topic some other individuals were talking about. But thoughts on the 6.5 PRC and especially the 300 PRC? There was some clicking issues supposedly, and then I guess when it first came out too, I don't know if it was cartridge design related, chamber design related, but I know some people had some issues with chambering or other sorts of incidents where they tried to use that cartridge and something just didn't work. What exactly was that? Have you heard of anything going on with those two cartridges at all?
I think the clicking thing, that's been around for a long time,
right?
And it is only been resurfaced with the PRC line of cartridges. But it's definitely a problem that has been around for a very long time. I think 6.5 284s really made it famous. But what you see there is the dimension above the web, that diameter dimension on a matched chamber, getting tight and then getting, either a couple of tenths or maybe even a thou smaller than the dimensions and tolerances listed on the SAMI websites. And the only times that we've been able to get a rifle that demonstrates that somebody had sent to us, because we've not experienced it here, that dimension, when you run a reamer that has been measured in that area, it cleans it out. You can spin it by hand and clean it out, and it can take away the problem. That's how we've seen it. But again, it was really popularized by the 6.5284. But any match cartridge that people run at magnum pressures, 60 to 64,000 pounds of pressure, if that area becomes really small in the chamber, you're going to get that. And again, like I said, it's only been resurfaced in the Magnum 6.5 PRC, 7 300 PRC, but it's present in anything if that dimension becomes too small. And you see a lot of that with manufacturers running reamers past the end of their service life, and that's when it becomes a problem. And that's like I said, my 2 cents. Jayden, how do you?
Yeah, I couldn't have put it better myself.
As far as the chambering goes, I don't know. I can't comment on that because I've not experienced that. I've not had anybody reach out to me. I kind of not spearheaded, but was kind of the point of contact for all of the commercial gun manufacturers for the 7 PRC when we launched that. And if you get a SAMI spec reamer, we always like to use high-speed steel. Just cuts a really good chamber. Obviously, the service life isn't as long as carbide, but a really good high-speed steel reamer made to SAMI spec. Punch that into a decent barrel, and you're gonna have a gun that shoots well. It's simple as that. The only time that I've heard problems, we've had recently we had a firearm, just a large company. We had a firearm returned to us. They're safe the chamber, and the chamber's in there crooked. So,
Man.
so those problems do exist, but when you do things correctly, it's an easy home run to chamber the PRCs, the Creedmoors, any of those, the ARC. It just makes it easy.
Yep.
This is going back to like the AMAX era. Why was the load on the back of the 6.5 Creedmoor AMAX ammo 41.5 grains of H4350?
That was you want it?
No, well, I'll add.
Okay. That was essentially a challenge to the reloader or the hand loader to try to make ammo that was better than we were factory producing. Like, could you reload better than this factory ammo was kind of the challenge. And so we put the recipe on the box. Now that was, 4350 lots that we were getting in, H4350 lots we were getting in, at cartridge launch time frame, and 41.5 grains was good. Maybe a little bit of tweak to that. I mean, 41.5 is a bit, might be a bit spicy in some of the stuff today.
Depending on the chamber.
Yeah, depending on the chamber. But yeah, that's why we did it. Like, hey, can you do better than this factory stuff? Because, for a long time it was held that factory ammo was not good enough to be used in a match. You had to reload to be competitive or whatever. So that's what it was about. I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, I was going to say there was that aspect of it, and there was also the 6.5 Creedmoor its initial launch wasn't out of the gate like the 7 PRC, for example, was. We turned the light switch on October 26th, and there were 30 different gun builders that had guns on the shelf in less than a month, right? It was instant. Well, with the Creedmoor, that wasn't the case. It was a very, very slow initial burn. So we wanted to do everything we could to foster the use of the cartridge in a match setting. And yeah, you want to do it. Here's what will duplicate factory ballistics.
We want to thank you guys, first of all, for being on the podcast, taking your time for us, especially because you guys got to get on the road to get to your match soon. Do you guys have any questions of us?
Wasn't prepared for that. It's like a job interview.
Curveball.
I ask that every time I'm on an interview board.
Yeah.
Did we do good?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, you guys did great.
Yeah, you guys gave us great information that we've been looking for, or just wanting some kind of clarification with whatnot. So
cool.
You guys did amazing. And the podcast you guys do is still, it's my favorite one right now. And that's not to blow wind up your skirt. Like, it's seriously like, especially like with your statistics ones, that's the one I've been like pushing for other people. I'm like, you think your 2-shot, 3-shot group is great. You think your 5-shot group is great. Go do this stuff. And we've been pushing each other of like, whenever we do a test, whatnot, we purposely try and validate it with like 10, 20 or more shot groups. So that's like, Was it good, or was it just a fluke that 5-shot group worked?
It's very humbling to put it in little words. So
yeah, I think that's doing that sample size stuff, and I know you guys have been doing it, and it has never been easier to get single digit SDs than when you shoot 60 shots. Because if it's good ammo with good propellant, it just happens. You don't even have to work for it. So that's kind of neat. No more chasing your tail. You got to shoot a little bit.
Well, right on. Again, Seth, Jayden, thank you guys so much for coming on the podcast, and really appreciate it. And I'm sure we'll have you guys on again with some more questions. And good luck at your match day too. Hope you guys win, and we'll talk to you guys soon.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
All right.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.